Hello, everyone, and welcome to Change Your Perspective live talk show and podcast. My name is Ketura Bartholomew, and this is another episode of our pilot talk show and podcast headed by the Zane Ketura International Institute of Pneumatology. Today, we are interviewing Zane, the president and headmaster teacher and master coach of this institute, on a topic that has been proven to be a controversial one today. That is, does God approve of same-sex marriages? Zane, a pleasant night to you, and how are you doing today?
A pleasant night to you too. And tonight I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing fine myself. Weather's a bit cool. That has me a little bit indoors and keeping warm and stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. So Zane, tonight's topic may be considered a controversial one. Does God approve of same-sex relationships and marriages?
This is an interesting topic indeed.
Yeah. There is a very common perspective that marriage is an institution created by God in which one man and one woman enter into an exclusive relationship for life. It is also said that marriage is the only form of partnership approved by God for sexual relations and homoerotic sexual practice incompatible with His will. So, our first question tonight is this concrete grounds in which one should use to disapprove same-sex relationships and marriages?
Nice. So as I said, this is actually a very interesting topic. So my first response to this would be that entire perspective from which that question comes is actually completely outside of the overall message of the Bible.
Okay.
Our pragmatic and experimental research at the International Institute of Pneumatology has actually proven that the scriptures are not meant to be a moral compass.
All right.
But a compass of functionality. And the question that you're just asking there, an entire premise that was stated is actually taken from a moral compass perspective. Even though marriage was an institution created by God, it was not an institution It was an institution incorporated within the confines of the human conundrum that was created by the Adam and inherited from the Adam. But marriage as we know it today was definitely not what God created it from the beginning.
All right. This is interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. So then, what is the difference between what we know now and what God has created?
Right. So in the modern Western world, a marriage is defined as a state, and this is how we view marriage in the Western world today. A marriage is defined as a state of being united as spouses in a consensual and contractual relationship, which is usually recognized by law.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, to understand what marriage is from the ancient Hebrew perspective of the scriptures, we must go back to the Genesis narrative to understand how the institution came about and what was the function of the institution. The first thing that is most noteworthy there is that there was no marriage as in contractual relationship in the Garden of Eden.
Okay.
Contractual relationships came about post-garden, after the Garden of Eden, after the Adam was put out of the garden.
I see. So, all right. So basically, what about Genesis 2 or because you mentioned that we're going back to the garden narrative, right?
right?
So what about Genesis 2, where it is written, "For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh"? Isn't that where God created, well, first created marriage?
So okay, so there are 2 points that I would raise concerning Genesis 2:24. Right. Number one, the first point is the Genesis narrative, as we know it in the Bible, was written by Moses. It's very important to note that it was not written at the time that the garden existed, which I believe is a very frequent misconception that most people have. That they believe that because it is actually written in Genesis, they somehow perceive, consciously or subconsciously, that what was written in Genesis was written when Genesis existed.
Yes,
And so
yes.
and so they read the entire narrative not as someone recounting something, but reading it as though the person that wrote it was actually there in the garden, or it is actually an account of someone that was there, or someone who was there. The Genesis narrative, as a matter of fact, was written at a considerable time after the Garden of Eden would have existed.
Okay.
And Moses apparently wrote this text at the time of the Mosaic, at the time when the Mosaic law was being ratified.
I see.
It is my understanding that what Moses wrote in Genesis there is meant to justify the institution of marriage in the Mosaic law by actually referencing the natural and the inherent union of man and woman in the Garden of Eden. That is in no way an indication that contractual relationship existed in the garden. And I think that would be logical, because if the man and the woman in the narrative were the first to have existed, then unless God came down in the garden as another man, put on a priestly robe, and called them under the arch by the big tree, and actually carried about this ceremony, then we definitely have no proof that a ceremonial procession took place, and we definitely have no proof that a contract was actually put in place in the Garden of Eden. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the second thing that I would actually raise is that the word that is translated wife in that verse is in fact woman. Right? It was translated as wife, but it's actually woman. As a man leave his wife and cleave to his woman. If you read on in the book of Genesis, now if you actually just pay attention to that there in particular, you see that on the note of that the word translated there is actually woman and not wife. If you interchange that with woman, therefore a man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his woman, then that actually opens up a totally different angle. Now,
Yeah, it does.
Now I'm going this route here firstly to identify what is the real context of marriage and the difference between the institution and what was. And there in that distinction, would I now bring it back to your question regarding same-sex marriages and same-sex relationships being approved or disapproved by God, right? So if you read on in the book of Genesis, you would also notice that there is a repetitive pattern of women becoming someone's woman when they quote unquote knew each other, or this man knew this woman, and he knew this woman is actually a reference to had sexual relations with. So in other words, in other words, what I'm actually saying is that how we understand marriage to be something that is very strict with regards to our legislations, our legal systems. In the Genesis narrative, if in the context of the Genesis narrative, a civilization is actually starting, then you need to actually think about the narrative from the era of the narrative. And it's very likely, if you think about it from that angle, it's very likely, it will become very evident and very likely in your mind that what we deem marriage is as a contractual relationship did not exist for a while.
Wow.
And so what we see in the Genesis narrative is when a man and a woman came together, then the woman actually began to be referred to as his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So not necessarily wife as we know it by law, but by the actual connection.
Wow, that just puts a whole new twist to this thing. I mean, just that translation, that little difference in the translation of the word really does give a different context as
Yeah,
in
it
comparison
would.
to what we are familiar with. So that brings me to another question then. What was it that Moses was referencing in the garden?
Nice. So that's another good question right there. So actually, what we do see particularly in that excerpt that you drew reference to, that's if I am clear, that's just Genesis chapter 2 verse 24.
Uh-huh.
What we do see particularly in that excerpt from narrative is that man was created to live from their nature, just like every other creation was created to live from theirs in the garden. Now you can see that, and when I say that, what I'm referring to is the man and woman was actually created to live from the nature, just like the other creation, such as and I'm referring here to let's just hypothetically refer to animals here.
Mm-hmm.
If you're referring to animals, then just as the male gender of the animal and the female gender of the animal was created to come together by nature, you do not actually try to draft a contract to marry two animals, right?
No.
Yeah, it's in their nature
Yeah.
for the respective gender to be attracted or to move towards the other gender during their mating season or their mating period. Yeah.
Yes, we see that.
In the Genesis narrative, from the ancient Hebrew perspective, what we see is that the man and woman was actually living from their nature. So in the same way, that is very evident and present in the other creation, it was also present in them. Now I'm saying that because there's a common misconception concerning God's communication to Adam to not eat from the tree of the God, to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden. It has been promulgated for a long time, and amongst westernized denominational Christianity, actually, that what was God's first commandment, that what God told Adam,
Mm-hmm.
that what God told Adam was actually God's first commandment that Adam disobeyed. But the narrative does not say that. To say that God gave a commandment in the garden is to say that God created imperfection.
Ah, okay.
Now, I would beg the listeners to pay attention to this component here in particular, because if you actually grasp this, then it will change the context of the narrative for you and brings it into the actual ancient Hebrew perspective. To say that God gave a commandment in the garden is to say that man was created with a flaw. He was created with an imperfection, because a law of thou shalt not is put in place to prevent unwanted behaviors.
Yes,
that would
that's true.
mean that the man was created in some way fractured. But the scriptures in particular does say that all God's works are perfect. So to say that God gave him a commandment, that in itself is actually contradicting the entire perspective of the scriptures. The ancient Hebrew perspective of the text, on the contrary, is that what God actually communicated to Adam was in fact breathed into Adam as his nature. Therefore, Adam's decision, and when I say breathed into him as his nature, just as you look at other creation, and you see other creation functioning from the inherent abilities or the inherent potential, that which we identify as nature, the inherent expression of what is in their energy or what is actually in their spirit. So what God told Adam was breathed into him from the ancient Hebrew perspective. Therefore, Adam's decision was one that was contrary to his nature when he ate from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when God told him, if you do this, if you eat from that tree, you will surely die, it was not a commandment with recompense. It was really God speaking from the law of sowing and reaping, which is actually what we see implemented in the first chapter of Genesis. Does that make sense so far?
Yes, it makes sense so far.
Right? Therefore, Adam's decision was in contrary to his nature, as I was saying, which is what his descendants inherited. Now, I'm saying all that to say that in the context of partnership, if we rein that into the context of partnership and sexuality, the Adam was created by nature to be faithful and bonded to one partner in the context of being in God's image and likeness. And when I say image and likeness here, we can state that in our modern English as God's image, as in his nature and his point of comparison. So in the context of partner and sexuality, the Adam was created by nature to be with one partner, right? Bonded to one partner and faithful. When the Adam ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or what I now refer to as the tree of his subjective knowledge of what is functional and dysfunctional, what he would have done was stepped away from his intended function and therefore became the opposite of what was breathed into him. That means that he began to function in the opposite of what he was created to be, which made him unfaithful and polygamous, like the animals, which, by the way, would be why God clothed him with animal skin, because he was no longer functioning image and likeness of Elohim in this context. He, by making this decision, chose his own image and likeness. And in the context of the narrative, we know that he chose his own image and likeness because chapter 5 of Genesis says that he reproduced in his own image and likeness.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
Right? So, which would be why God clothed him with animal skin. It was actually an indication that his own image and likeness removed him from the frequency, so to speak, if we use some of the modern terminology that they're being attributed to spirit. He removed himself from that frequency on functioning from the God nature and began to function from the frequency of the animal kingdom. And that is actually referred to, and that is actually like that because in the context of the narrative, God, Adam actually, well, Eve, listening to the voice of the serpent, was actually using the serpent as a reference point. She began to use the serpent as an image and likeness that was communicated to the Adam, and the story continues from there. So, when in the context of God clothing him with the animal skin, it brought him to that. And so he became just like an animal. An animal would actually go around and have relations with any other animal.
Yeah.
Now, the institute of marriage, being part of a legal system, came about as a remedy to that fractured nature. Moses speaking to people with a fractured nature, who was clearly told in their contract, in the Mosaic contract, that the implementation of the contract or the legal system or these commandments, quote unquote, was for the purpose of not following their heart, because their heart was now in the image and likeness of their father, the Adam. It refers to the perfection. He actually refers to the perfection of the union in the garden as justification for the implementation of the institution of marriage.
I see. Okay, I'm following so far.
Nice. Now, having said that, now to answer your question, right? And in the context of your question, the question that you posed, take into consideration the institution of marriage came about to solve the conundrum of a fractured human nature. I think that to ask if God approves of same-sex marriages is an irrelevant question in the context of the overall message of the Bible.
Okay, that's an interesting point. So why would you say then that it is irrelevant?
Well, if you take into consideration the overall, and I'll actually give you two reasons, but before I give you those two reasons, if you take into consideration the overall spectrum or the overall panorama of the scriptures, what you do see present is that man was created in perfection, and created in perfection, he was living from his heart.
Right.
Which actually came through God breathing. Everything that God said was breathed into him from the ancient Hebrew perspective. Therefore, he functioning in the context of sexuality and relationship, he would have actually been functioning from the nature of God, which is that faithful nature and that one of bonding with one partner in the context of sexuality. What took place in the garden is really he actually began to function contrary to his nature. If you look at this in the panorama, that is, he began to function. He began to function contrary to his nature, which made him the opposite of whatever he chose as a reference point to compare himself to or to measure himself against, now became the reference point from which his identity and his character was definitely defined. Now, if it is not God, then it would be automatically opposite of God.
Yeah.
And if he's actually using that external reference point as a definition, whatever he's using as his reference point to define his character and his identity, then his as I was saying there just now, his nature is pretty much opposite to faithful and monogamous.
Yeah.
If you look further down, this is actually why the Messiah was necessary, and why the New Testament writers actually indicate that there is the end of the law in the presence of the Messiah. Because when the Messiah came, what the Messiah came to do, Jesus or Yeshua, the Messiah, he came to actually, I put it like this: he actually came to give rebirth to man. So what he did on the cross was, in the context of what the New Testament writers indicate, he nailed that fractured nature to the cross for everyone. For everyone. That's why Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 that if one died, all died. And he said that, and he said clearly in 2 Corinthians that God is holding sin to no man. Which means Jesus is the restoration of what was made in the garden. The first Adam made his decision according to his nature, and everybody inherited it. Jesus now came and made a decision for everyone, and so everyone has actually benefited from that once and for all.
Woohoo, Jesus!
Right? Which means the question that we're asking here today is actually a question that is in negation of what Jesus did on the cross. Because if Jesus actually killed that nature for everyone, and the Apostle Paul was sent out to preach Christ anew to those who were not of the circumcised circle, those who were not of the circle of the circumcised, he did not say that it is not indicated that he went to the uncircumcised circle, it is not indicated that he went outside of the circumcised circle to say Christ will be in you if you accept him. He went out to the uncircumcised to preach Christ in you.
I was about to say, hold up. I just heard Christ in you. That just
exactly.
Okay. All right. I'll take this one step at a time.
Well, the New Testament writers also indicate Christ is all and in all, and that all have been reconciled via that cross, which actually makes the question in the present society as to whether same-sex marriages is approved or disapproved by God as totally irrelevant, because that is a question in negation of what Jesus did, and really saying that people are that people are still in a position prior to the cross. They're still with that fractured nature. So and I give you, these are my two reasons. Number one, Jesus as the Messiah came to fix that fractured nature once and for all. Through him, everyone has been reconciled.
Okay.
That therefore means that no one is disapproved by God in any form or fashion. From a divine perspective, God is holding sin against no man.
Let that sink in.
That means that God is not part of man's subjective perspectives of which codependent identity is greater than the other.
Yeah.
So to identify that and as a problem, then what you're actually doing is taking it upon yourself to apply a subjective rule of measure as to which codependent reference point is greater than the other. The second is, if Jesus restored the nature of man as the Bible confirms that he did, as I was just saying, then the question is not whether God approves or disapproves of this. The question is, how do we get people away from the codependent references that they are using for identity on a whole and get back to living from the heart, where God is in everyone.
Wow. I mean, that was awesome. And that's a very unique perspective. It really does present why the question is irrelevant, as you were rightfully saying, and the whole conundrum that Jesus actually rectified.
Yes, it does. Completely.
Yeah. So I see we have a few listeners. Just shout out to some of our listeners. Let me just see. Shout out to Hannah, Tanya, Richard, Vince, Shelly, Chris. Much love to each and every one of you, and to the others that I missed. And Zane, thank you so much for sharing all of that. It was very insightful.
Thank you very much for having me and for asking the question. Relevant questions for society today.
Indeed. So that brings us to the end of this podcast, this segment. Does God approve of same-sex marriages and relationships? If you would like to learn more on this topic from Zane, please visit Zane Kekatsura International Institute of Pneumatology at www.internationalinstituteofpneumatology.com. Or you can find Zane's personal online feed on Patreon. That is www.patreon.com/Zane_LEL_Fuego FUEGO. Yeah. So that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us. For those who I missed, we love each and every one of you, and do have a blessed night. Good night, everyone.